Good morning, everybody. A special welcome to George and Roberta's friends that have come to us from Saugatuck and maybe Hope College in order to hear George's story. George Kraft was born the son of missionary parents in China. He did his undergraduate work at Wheaton College, majoring in history. After spending 2 years as an infantry officer in the United States Army, he pursued graduate work at the University of Indiana, where he learned of Hope College and the college's plans to establish a physical education major and the need to enlarge the facility. Dr. Kraft was a Hope College faculty member from 1967 until his retirement as professor of kinesiology in 2005. He was the college's wrestling coach from 1967 to 1978, and he was an assistant football coach from 1967 to 1997. He was chair of the Department of Kinesiology from 1988 to 2003. While he was the department chair, the DeVos Fieldhouse was designed and built. In 2013, the Performance Lab at the DeVos Fieldhouse was named in honor of Hope College educator and coach, Dr. George Kraft. I first met George and Roberta when my husband and I joined Hope Church. He was an elder, and he assured Bill that maybe, my husband, that maybe if he didn't really agree with every single word in the Apostles' Creed or the question and answers in the Heidelberg Catechism, he would still be welcome, and so would I at Hope Church. And
still feel that way.
He actually taught a class in adult ed in some of the first years that we were here, a class about gospel songs and hymns. And I think Roberta helped with that and did the accompaniment, and we sang several hymns. I do remember that well. So George, tell us about your book, A Place to Call Home, A Missionary Kid's Tale.
Thank you, Judy. If you want copies of the book, they're here. And Realty said to give you a special deal today, $20. So all you're going to do is slip a $20 in the envelope and you have a book. So if I get done and you're interested, we have some there for you. I'm a visual learner, and I feel strongly that it's better to see something once than to hear about it 1,000 times. Or that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I have a lot of slides today, and I brought along some visual aids. And particularly when I was younger, I was a person that learned visually and through doing things, not so much through reading and hearing, but through visually and doing. That was my childhood. Really, that's kind of how I learned most effectively. So that's why I've got the slides and the pictures. Paul Husingfeld, where's Paul? Paul's here today. Paul was so gracious to write such a nice little preface for the book. It really frames the book beautifully in his preface. And Paul and I talked about his book, Elephant Baseball, and it was a motivator for me to get going and get started on my book as well. So let's just kind of right away jump right into some of these slides. And just a quick geography lesson. I might just mention something about geography. Missionary kids, I think, are just naturally interested in geography. And when I left for China in 1945, I was 5 years old. My Aunt Helen, my dad's younger brother, gave me this actual stamp album. And over the years, most missionary kids collect stamps. And I have over 2,500 stamps from 150 different countries that I put into this book. So I think just through stamps, just through seeing stamps, taking stamps, putting them in the book, you learn a lot about geography that way. And that was, so for me, I think all missionary kids love geography, basically because we've been so many places, and most of us all had stamp collections. Another visual aid that I just wanted to bring along is this little packet here. Very, very important in the Chinaland mission was the memory of Scripture. To memorize the King James Version of the Bible. The King James was the only valid version of Scripture, of course. And I always thought as a child that good King James was at his office and must have gotten writer's cramps because he started with, in the beginning, God created, then he finished with Revelation 20. He wrote the whole book out. Well, of course, that's not the case, but we memorized from it. And what every child in the school had was a little bamboo sheath. And in this bamboo sheath was a little accordion style like this. And on one side of the accordion was the Bible verse, and the other side you wrote the verse out. So we were given these. It had 100 sides, and you'd write out, they'd give you 100 scripture verses to memorize. So you'd put the verse on one side, write it out in perfect British penmanship on the other side, and then you'd carry it with you in your pocket. And as you went along during the day, you'd pull it out and you'd memorize these verses. So we as kids memorized hundreds and hundreds, and it was kind of a point of pride, the person who had the most of these 100-verse memory packets by the side of their bed. And I wasn't particularly a strong student, but Bible memory has come fairly easily to me. So I had 5, 6, 7, or 8 of these on the side of the bed. So we memorized hundreds and hundreds of verses. The second thing I wanted to show you was our hymnal. All the way from first grade through 12th grade, every day, not every week, every day, as a missionary kid, I sang hymns from this book. There's 705 hymns. There are psalms, hymns, and gospel songs. We all had this by our nightstand in China, and every night before we went to sleep, we could pick a hymn or two to sing. So, needless to say, 12, 13 years of doing that, you learn hundreds and hundreds of hymns. So this was certainly something that was very important in my childhood. And in fact, how many books do you see that have, on the very opening page, a picture of a hymn book cover? When Johanna Smith from the Von Ralph Institute reread my book, she's a project editor, she said, "George, it's obvious to me as I read your book how important hymns, psalms, hymns, and gospel songs have been to you. You should start every chapter with a verse of a hymn from the hymn book," which I did. And I knew when she said that, I knew the very first hymn that I would open it up with. So in the first chapter, it's this hymn. Far, far away in heathen darkness dwelling, millions of souls forever will be lost. Who will go, salvation story telling, looking to Jesus, counting not the cost. All power is given unto me, all power is given unto me. Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel, and lo, I am with you all the way. Of course, the Great Commission at the end, but I think, remember those 4 words, counting not the cost. I thought that maybe I would even title the book, Counting Not the Cost, at one time. So anyway, that's the hymn I opened the book with. Let's get into some of these slides. Mark Cook from our church did all the slides, and this one's pretty straightforward, but there's about 11 maps in the book, and it's worth the price of the book just to get Mark Cook's maps. They're just unbelievable. But a quick geography lesson here. This is middle of I call it the China-Japan War. Most people call it the World War II. This was sort of the extent of the Japanese controlled area during the Second World War. I was born in Chengdu. Here's Shanghai, of course, here's Hong Kong. And note this little peninsula here. I'll mention just across from Korea. I'll note that in just a minute. And maybe one other location, Kalimpong, right up here, way up in the tip of India. Kind of keep in mind that one. So, and Lhasa, of course, the capital of Tibet. So that's a quick little review there. Little close-up of eastern China. The Chifu schools that I went to were right here in this peninsula. It's in the Shandong. Oh yeah, they're in the right. The school is here in Chifu. This is the province of Shandong, and that's where Hudson Taylor, the founder of the mission, set up the school in 1881. And then the other point I want to point out here is here's the Yangtze River. Here's Zhujiang or Guling. In 1995, Guling was declared a National Heritage Site. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world. And that's where I ended up going to school most of the time that I was in China. This is a wonderful picture. This is 4 ladies going to China. It's my mother here. Anybody know who that is? How many of you know John Cox? That's John Cox's mother. John's mom, Grace Liddell, went over to China on the same ship that my mother did. That was they left in October of 1934. So I call this 2 pearls and 2 graces. And I just wanted to read just a brief section here. This is Miriam Cox, John's older sister, who I grew up with in the mission home in Wheaton, Illinois, had this to say about her mother in a book that she wrote. If we can find it here. Perhaps my mother's anonymity is an apt metaphor for her life. She was one of the many single women who left home during the first half of the 20th century to go to a country half a world away, devoid of personal comforts and conveniences. To them, that didn't matter. It didn't matter that they were risking a lifetime label of spinster because so few men were inclined to go. It didn't matter that they might not be successful or attain a notoriety. Even personal safety did not matter. What mattered to them, as it did to the Apostle Paul, was to finish the race and complete the task the Lord Jesus had given them, the task of testifying to the gospel of God's grace. Interesting enough, all 4 of those ladies, even there were very few men missionaries, mostly women missionaries, they all 4 got married and they all had children. So in that case, it's had a different ending than some. So that's that's their 4 of them in language school. So my mother in language school. The founder of the mission really wanted the missionaries to dress like the native people. So you see most of the time my mom and dad are dressed in the native garb. What the mission did after about six months of intense Bible study, Bible language training, they would send the missionaries out to an older, more seasoned missionary. And this lady in the middle, Laura Muller, was a missionary in Shaanxi province. So Pearl Galloway and my mother spent 6 months with her learning Chinese customs and getting more accustomed to the Chinese way of life. This is my father with his first language teacher. My dad's a fascinating person. He was 6'4", 225, big man, strong as an ox, not an ounce of body fat on him, and an extremely good athlete. And interesting enough, and John, you probably know this, my dad's best skills were swimming, diving, and golf. With a man of that size, how could he at that size be a diver? Well, he was an exceptional diver. Picture of him with a stack of his language books in language school. This is my dad meeting my mother for the first time in China, proposing to her for marriage. And there they are on their wedding day. You wonder about this beautiful wedding dress there. My mother was not the first one to wear that dress, and she wouldn't be the last one to wear it. You know, they would be passed around. Wedding dresses weren't that easy to get in China. So anyway, that's a nice picture of them, and they were married in Chengdu, where I was born. My mom and dad getting ready to go up to Kangding. I don't know how you were weighed as a child, but that's my dad weighing me. Hopefully I'm growing properly. Oh, I missed one there. I could probably spend a half hour on this picture, but I won't. This is the China Tea Trail, fascinating trail. To get up to Tibet, where my parents were missionaries, you had to take the China Tea Trail. It was the only way to get there. And the story, it's also called the Tea Horse Road. And really the Tibetans basically had a barley beer and yak milk and cold water to drink, and that was it. And they desperately wanted a warm beverage. Well, you can't grow tea and coffee on the plateaus of Tibet. So they would, in Sichuan province down in Yunnan province, I understand they were 2 of the first tea growing places in the world. So these porters would put the tea bags on their backs, and they'd go up this very hazardous China tea trail, and they would go all the way up into Tibet. And you had to go over so many rope bridges that it wasn't possible for donkeys or mules to take the tea up to where my parents were missionaries. So that's the way they carried it. And when they'd get to Tibet, what did the Chinese get in return? For about that much tea, that's 220 pounds, the Chinese would get a Tibetan horse called a nansheng. And the Chinese desperately needed these horses in their battles against the marauders that came down from the north. And this trade started about the 6th century AD and continued then until the Second World War, when the communists built some motor roads and bridges that no longer made that necessary. But my mom and dad and I went up and down that trail several times. This is the, my dad took this picture. This is the Autobahn of roads. This is, I'm serious, this is the finest road getting you from Western China to Tibet. And virtually everybody would have to go over this particular bridge. So that's why it is such a sturdy bridge. Oftentimes, my dad would have to carry my mother because the bridges would just be like 2 ropes to walk on and two ropes to keep your hands on. So they'd put effort and energy here since it was such a key bridge. And just a quick comparison here. When the Chinese communists, the bridge you just saw was right here over the Dadu River. This is the bridge the communists have put in. You see it. You see the bridge plows right into the mountain here. In 20 minutes, you'll come out the other side of this mountain. How long did it take my parents to do that 20 minutes when they went up now? 4 days. So what took 4 days, you now do in 15 minutes. And China, communist China has built, the infrastructure is unbelievable. We've been back more recently, and the airports, the bridges, the roads, the tunnels, it's just incredible. There's where my parents were missionaries in Kangding, they just have a gorgeous airport, 14,000 feet above sea level. But you just come on in there. In fact, when you come in, to the right side, it says oxygen room. And you can go into the oxygen room and maybe get some oxygen. But that's a picture of the new bridge, which makes the old bridge obsolete. Wonderful photo here. I didn't know this photo existed until a year and a half ago. Wheaton College is the archives for the China Inland Mission, the Billy Graham Center. So if you're ever down at Wheaton and want to go to the Billy Graham Center, which is worth a visit, just to go to the Billy Graham Center on the 3rd floor, the CMS archives. This is my dad preaching to a group of Tibetans and Chinese there in the city of Kangding. This is a great picture. This is my father. This is what he would have spent a lot of his time doing, would be sharing the gospel with these muleteers. These are the people that would carry that tea back and forth from Lhasa to where my parents were missionaries. Just want to point out something here. These are the tea bags stacked against the back wall here. And one of the feats of strength that all Tibetan muleteers did was to demonstrate their strength by seeing how many with a pitchfork, how many of those bags they could stack on top of each other. And no Tibetan ever exceeded 18. My dad could almost with ease do 21. So the word of this big, strong Westerner who spoke fluent Tibetan, my dad happened to be essentially a linguistic genius. They would gather just to say, we gotta hear what this guy's got to say. You know, if he's got this kind of strength. So my dad would spend a lot of time doing that sort of thing up in Tibet. In the middle of the Second World War, my dad decides that it's time for our family to come home to Minneapolis. And so this is a map that Mark put together, and it's a pretty straightforward map. But anyway, this part of the map is interesting. The Japanese, as you know, in the Second World War, took control of Burma, and the land routes, you couldn't get to China land routes, so the United States started transporting C-47s over the hump to get material from India to China. And so right in the middle of the Second World War, we get on a plane. I'm about 3 years old, about 3.5 years old. My brother's 2. And we get on this plane and we go over the hump to India. And then from India, from India, we went down the Indian Ocean down to Cape of Good Hope in Africa. And then from there to Buenos Aires in Argentina, over the hump to Santiago, Chile, through the Panama Canal into Havana. This is all during the Second World War. Most of the time our ship was in blackout because of fear for German submarines. My dad did take an Argentinian vessel for this part of the trip to South America because the Japanese were not firing on ships carrying the Argentinian flag. So that was a 6-month trip. And here's a picture of us when we arrive in. There we are. This is a picture in the Minneapolis Tribune. There were two, the Minneapolis Tribune and the Minneapolis Star were both at the train station when we arrived, with reporters and photographers wondering what is with this family. So anyway, that's a picture of the 4 of us as we arrived back in the middle of the Second World War. That would have been in May of '43. This is Hudson Taylor, the founder of the mission, absolutely a remarkable man. In 1865, he was on Brighton Beach in England, and he had a vision from God that says, Hudson, I want you to get missionaries to inland China. At that time, the Reformed Church and Presbyterian Church, they had a lot of missionaries on the coast, but there were no missionaries inland. And so in 20 years, from 65 to 85, 240 missionaries in that short span of time were in inland China. An amazing man. I'd recommend reading Hudson Taylor's Spiritual Secret. But he just an incredible strong personality. This is my parents up in Tibet. I might just, between these pictures, my dad, he was so anxious to get back to China, and the armistice with Japan was signed in September 2, 1945. So in November of '45, our family was back to Shanghai. But one of the trouble there was that the school hadn't come back. The school had left China and had gone over the hump to Kalimpong, India. And my dad didn't know when the school was going to come back. So here I am, and here we are in China. My brother, I'm just turning 6. My brother's 4, and we land in Shanghai. And what's my dad going to do? My dad has to get back up to Tibet to witness for Christ to the Tibetans. And so that was a tough time for me. They left me with a German family at that time that didn't speak a word of English for 6 months until the school came back over from India. And I can remember that as not being a particularly happy time. But soon the kids came over from India, and the school was temporarily set up in Shanghai. And once I had friends, I was happy as a lark. You know, friends make a big difference, don't they? But anyway, my dad then went up to Tibet, and I might just read something from my mother in this regard. Obviously, the elephant in the room when you talk about 19th and early 20th century missionaries is, what about families? And my mother said this. Dad seemed reconciled to leaving me in Shanghai. It was more difficult for Mom, but she consoled herself with the promises of Scripture. Mom shared her heartache with this brief narrative in a prayer letter. She wrote about a night on her long trip to Kongding after leaving me in Shanghai, over 3 weeks one way. So I didn't see my parents very often. 4-year-old Dick had woken during the night saying, I'm tired, I'm dirty, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty. I wish I was back in Minneapolis. But she soothed him, then went on to say, we left our precious George in Shanghai, an American boy in China, living with a German family and attending a British school. But then, as my mother always did, and you'll see this throughout the book, she had a verse or a scripture passage to quote. And the one she used here is, though there is no man that hath left children for my sake and the gospel's, but he shall receive 100-fold. We are claiming children from the Tibetans. Pray with us. And then Don Lydon's editor added this sentence: the sacrifice of leaving her son behind was well worth the claiming of young Tibetan lives from eternal damnation. And while I'm on that, I'll just maybe make one more quote. This is 16 years later. My parents are in Taiwan, and I just would like to share this from my mother. I can find it here. Yeah, this is like 60. They're in Taiwan now. August was an important month for the Krafts. On August 12th, Dick turned 21 years old. On August 17th, George Jr. graduated from Wheaton College and was commissioned as second lieutenant in the United States Army. On August 20th, our Lois entered her teens, and on August 25, George and Roberta Conard, a Wheaton classmate, were married in Denver, Colorado. According to all reports, it was a beautiful wedding, with Dick as the best man and Lois as one of the bridesmaids. How we would love to have been in the USA for the month of August. But now Mom quotes a hymn: not what I wish to do, nor where I wish to go. For who am I that I should choose my way? The Lord will choose for me. 'Tis better far I know. So let him bid me go or stay. In a sense, my mother put God called me to be a missionary. I'm doing what God called me to do. Whether God had called her to have 3 children or not, I don't know. I never asked her. I do know that, but just an aside here, my sister told me this, and I didn't know this until after the book was written. Mother was 7.5 years older than my father, and he had approached another woman, Laura Robinson, and asked Laura if she'd be willing to marry him. And Laura said, where do you want to be a missionary, and do you want to have children? And Dad said, I want to go up into Tibet. My sister thinks my dad was an adventurer who happened to be a Christian. And there is some truth to that. But anyway, so she turned to, she said, and I do not feel right having children. So my dad turned to a second choice, who was my mother. But the final part of that story is 45 years later, when my mom passed away of cancer, guess who Dad married? This woman who remained single her whole life. They were married. They had 2 years together, then she died of cancer. And then my dad married a third time. And so that's an interesting little story. Anyway, this is Dad obviously with the Tibetan people here that he ministered to. My dad spoke absolute fluent, calm dialect Tibetan, so was able to communicate with them. And I visited my parents once from 46 to 51, and that's a picture of me there. It took 3 weeks to get up to the Tibetan border one way, so 3 weeks up, 3 weeks back, and I had 1 week with them at Christmas. So the rest of the other Christmas, the next Christmas I spent with some friends at missionaries that were closer to the mission school. Then I spent a Christmas at the mission school, and I really liked that Christmas. Then a Christmas back again with their friends. And then the last Christmas was an interesting one. But anyway, that's Dad ministering to the Tibetans. You can see the sheepskin. The yak is absolutely essential to life. Tibetans cannot exist without the yak. That's yak clothing turned inside out. Yaks provided the covering for their tents. The dung provided heat for them. The meat, of course, they ate. A lot of the fat was made into candle wax. So the yak is an essential animal in Tibetan life. That's just a picture of Mom and Dad. Here's that Nanchang horse, this short, sturdy horse that the Chinese would get in exchange. So 220 pounds worth of tea was good for one of those horses. That was the swap. The mission set up in Shanghai, and it was not an ideal location. It was right after the Second World War. The city was in a bit of shambles, but had to be somewhere, so they set up there. But then we got on this airplane and we flew to a place called Guling, Lushan Mountain in Guling. I said it's a World Heritage Site, and it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. And this is a map. I would imagine Mark Cook spent 100 hours on this map. This is the most definitive map that you're going to find of Guling in the years 1947 to 1950. And I'd like to go through all of this, but anyway, this is where the mission school settled, and it's just a gorgeous area. And to document that, Pearl Buck's parents built a home here. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek ran his summer business for the Kuomintang was right here in Kangding. And interesting enough, Mao Zedong and Madam Chiang Kai-shek's villa is right here. Oh dear, I touched this as I was pointing. Villa is right here, and when the Chinese had to leave mainland and flee to Taiwan or Formosa, guess who took over Chiang Kai-shek's villa? Mao Zedong. Same villa, same place. And Mao then did a lot of his work in the summers right from here. So it was just one of the most beautiful places in all of China, and that's where I got to go to school. In fact, I'll just quote it a little bit here. 170 peaks. 20 valleys, 16 mountain streams, 22 waterfalls, 3,000 varieties of plants, 2,000 specimens of insects, 170 varieties of birds, and 22 types of animals. So it wasn't just beautiful for its topography, it was just incredible in terms of its flora and fauna. And I'm a visual learner. And to be honest, I don't remember. I left Guilin when I was 11 years old. I have no memory of being in a classroom. Now that's weird for an 11-year-old. I have all kinds of memories. My butterfly net, catching butterflies, catching caterpillars, watching them create their cocoon, coming into becoming butterflies. I remember those kinds of things. And of course, sports I remember. But I don't remember being in a classroom. Really kind of strange. This is just a view. This is a view from Lushan Mountain looking down into, this is the Poyang Lake. This was one of our favorite swimming holes. We had about 15 of these. And of course, as you got older and older, you would dare people to jump and dive off the top into the pool. So when I was there, it was called Three Graces Pool. Communists have changed the name to Black Dragon Pool, so now it's called Black Dragon Pool. This is our mission school. Stanley Houghton, our headmaster, right here, and school teachers. My brother is here with his hand on his chin, and this is me right there. The only, no bicycles or automobiles, of course, up in Guling, only walking. The only way you got there was through walking. These are called huagans. We'd call them carrying chairs. And the younger children then we'd sit in these huagans, and porters would take you on up 1,000 steps. It was a 10-mile trip, and porters would get you up to Guling. And that's another picture of huagans taking the younger children up the steps. This is the swimming. We all have an old swimming hole, right, that we learned to swim. This is my swimming hole. This is where we learned to swim. My dad and Mom were able to visit us once during those 4 years that we were up there. And this 10-meter dive, my dad, John, there are not many 6'4", 225-pound divers around. But my dad could do all the Olympic dives. And back in those days, it was the swan dive, the jackknife, the reverse dive, 1.5 in a tuck position, 1.5 in a pike position. My dad could do every one of them. I mean, he was just, for men of that size, just an incredibly skilled athlete. And he would wow us and the other teachers with his diving skills when he visited us. This is our headmaster, Stanley Houghton. If you want to read about the mission after Hudson Taylor, I'd probably read about Stanley Houghton. Unfortunately, he was in his mid-40s, and he was playing tennis with one of our women teachers. As I remember, almost all of our teachers were single women, and they were all graduated from top schools in England. We had top-notch education, extremely demanding education. And he was playing with one of the women in tennis, and he had a massive heart attack and died. And I can remember the whole school gathering, we sang Psalm 46. You know that? God is our refuge and our strength. In trouble, a very present help. Therefore will not we fear. Therefore will not we fear. The Lord of hosts is with us. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge, was the hymn that we sang then at his funeral. This is an interesting picture. While my brother and I were growing up in Guling, we had a little trailer sister that was born. She's 10 years younger than me. And of course, we had never met her, seen her, and anxious to do so. So in Christmas of 1950, the mission for some reason, communism had taken over, the communist was declared the People's Republic of China was October 1, 1949. So it was extremely dangerous to be traveling in China, and particularly to be traveling up into Tibet. But for some reason, the mission said, okay, George and Dick, I think you should make an attempt to get back to see your parents up in Tibet. I think it was an impossible idea to begin with, and we never made it to Tibet. But this was my sister. We kind of wanted to meet her, and so my parents applied to the communist government to be able to return to come down and pick up Dick and me and come back to the United States. And some of those, my dad went through some pretty harrowing interrogations by the communist government, but they finally released them, and they came down, picked us up, and came back to the United States. This is our picture of our family back in the States, and all the maybe close to 1,000 missionaries in the channel of mission had to make a decision what to do. And China's closed now to the gospel. What are we going to do? So the mission decided to rename itself the Overseas Missionary Fellowship, and it went into the Pacific Rim countries, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, where my parents went, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, right around there. My parents decided to go back to Taiwan. And that was an interesting time for the mission, because when the mission school was in China, you went there through high school. You'd be through then you'd come back to the States for college or whatever. But when the mission came back, they decided to change that. Missionary children would go to a small mission school near where their parents are missionaries. Like my sister went to one in Taiwan, about an hour and a half from where my parents lived. So the various countries had these small mission schools. When you turn 6 years old, I'm 10 years old, about the time you finished grade school, you would then come back home and live in your passport country. So when you're 10, you would then come and the mission felt that 7 years was probably too long a time to have children separated from their parents. So at that time, they made the decision then that parents would come back every 4 years. So I was going into 7th grade here, so I saw my parents when I was in 7th grade, then I saw them when I was in 11th grade, then when I was a junior in college, and then 2 years after college, and 6 years after college, 10 years after college. And as I read from mother, you know that my mother missed a lot of important dates in her family's lives because of that. This is they set up these mission homes and mission hostels. This is one they set up in Wheaton, Illinois. And they had another one in suburbs of Philadelphia, 2 in Canada, several in England, 1 in Australia. So that when you turned 10, you would then go back and live in a mission home. This was our guardian here, Mr. Ernest Culver, and these were the children that grew up in that mission school environment. Don Lyons was nice enough to let me continue. This was when I was at Wheaton College. I got to show this picture because when I was at Wheaton, my first day on campus, I saw this girl here. We called them girls then, and I thought she was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. And so I decided I want to meet her. But to be honest, Robbie was everybody wanted to date Robbie. I couldn't even get my toe in the door. So for 3 years, I literally, this is true, and Robbie will have to agree to this. For 3 years, I tried to pay attention to me, and she wouldn't. But finally, in our senior year, she must have, I think, you ever heard of senioritis? Remember people that our age called senioritis? You needed to find your spouse when you were a senior in college, because if you didn't find your spouse when you were a senior, you maybe never would get married. So Anyway, I don't know if that was the case now, but here, obviously, you can see by our senior year I had succeeded. That's a nice shot. Great picture of my dad. What do you think? When I look at this picture, what do you think I think of? I see my dad's hands. Here he is in his early 80s. He's in his early 80s. His hands are twice the size of, literally twice the size of mine. And in his early 80s, he could take you and just crush you with his hands. Just a powerful man. He never graduated from college, but he was just a towering intellect. No Westerner spoke and wrote Sichuanese, Mandarin, Tibetan, the Com dialect of Tibetan, wrote and spoke both as fluently as my father. He just was kind of in another zone. As you know, Robbie and I do a lot of musical programs, and that's just a picture of the two of us. I don't know when that picture was taken. One of the first programs I did was Stephen Foster in Song and Story. It's a 50-minute program, and we haven't done it for 5 or 6 years. I could still sing and quote the whole program for you. It's just strange. You know, how some of it built, I don't know why. My brain is wired to memorize, but not to do a lot of other things. I'm so glad that we have one grandchild, okay, and she's this gal right here. And just serendipitously, she's here today. So I'm so glad, Jenny, you could be here. And we took Jen on a lot, since we just had one grandchild, we took her a lot of different places. And I'd organized a football exchange when I was chair of the Department of Kinesiology between the University of Querétaro and Hope College. And there's Jenna being a cheerleader for the University of Querétaro. And it was wonderful to play those games and Robbie and I, we've been to Querétaro 4 or 5 times. We're just treated royally down there. You think we were kings and queens or something. We go on down there, but I went down there to help them with their football program, that the Football Americano, as they call it. And it's just a tradition for me is every Friday, I think about a year after we came to Hope, 1968, every Friday morning, I've gone out with male friends to have breakfast. It's just, when I was a kid, I wanted to be around people. As an adult, I want to be around people. I think my desire to be around people in many ways is what saved me as a child from some of the struggles and challenges that a lot of missionary kids have had. And this is just a picture of, Jack Nienhuis and my close friend Sheldon Weddick, who passed away 4 years ago, and of course Bob Ritz and myself, and John Patnot's now joined the group, and Dave Zwart, I think. David, so we keep the tradition going, and it's get caught up on things on Friday mornings. Picture of my brother. We went back to Tibet in 2012. Just a nice picture of us with 3 Tibetan kids there. And I always wear my Hope hat wherever I go. So just a picture there of 2 of us. Don Lydon has decided to put a little 6-page chapter in the book called The Berlin Interlude. Chris, you would be interested in this one and enjoy reading the chapter. I happened to be stationed, Robbie and I had just gotten married, and I was sent, I took ROTC in college, and I wanted, Robbie and I both thought we were going to make the military a career, but I no sooner got married that the Army sent me on temporary duty to Germany and Berlin. And I said, I don't think so. I've had too many separations in my life, and I'm not going to tolerate being separated from the person that is the love of my life. So we bailed on that idea. But I was stationed in Berlin when Kennedy gave his Ich bin ein Berliner speech. I'm not a photographer at all, but my platoon was stationed at this corner to offer protection. And I would say maybe 10 minutes after that picture was taken, Kennedy gave his speech. I wish I could have actually been at the checkpoint. I was one of the officers in charge of Checkpoint Charlie. We rotated 3 of us. We were on for 12 hours and off for 24. And if I'd been there, he actually mounted a scaffold like Ronald Reagan did. I don't think he had any profound words like, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. But he did go up onto the scaffold. This picture is on the cover of the book, talking about male friends. This is, of course, Ray Smith, This is my mentor, really, in many ways, Russ Tibet. Some of you know him, and of course, Jim Boltman. And it just was four of us. I went to the football game yesterday, and I asked my friend David I said, David, how many paid coaches do they have on the football staff now? And it looked like 10. But back in those days, for years, it was the four of us. And this was one of the most wonderful experiences of my entire life. I'll never forget it. The privilege and the opportunity to work with these guys for years and years as a coach was just wonderful. That's a picture of Boltman and myself trying to pretend like we know what we're doing up in the crow's nest. I don't even know where that picture was taken. So those are some pictures. When you get home tonight, I don't know if we'll have time today. When you get home, I really encourage you to just punch in "Tigers in the Grass" by Richard Lane. It's quite a moving number. I think you've got copies of the words there. And it's a story. Richard Lane is a overseas missionary fellowship kid, and he wrote this video called "Tigers in the Grass." And I know Paul has listened to it. It's just a haunting melody. And you see the words there in front of you. I could just read some of those words, Jen. It's just, I'd really just punch it into your computer. They took him to a railroad station. They packed him up on board. They said, "Send him up a mountain jungle in the name of our dear Lord." The pain and separation killed him. It took away the years. It took away his innocence and replaced it with those fears. They took her to a taxi cab around 1,000 twists. Her poor young soul would melt within her like the tears of jungle mists. You can read it for yourself, but the melody that goes with that, I challenge you to not have a dry eye when you get done listening to Richard Lane's rendition of that particular number. So that's just a quick summary of my experience, and I know you all have. I don't claim that my experience is any more dramatic or different than anybody else's. We all have had life experiences. Mine maybe has had a few more twists and turns than some, but I know that several of you have read the book. And so I'm just going to, is David Myers here by any chance? I don't think David thought he might be able to make it, but anyway, I'm just going to open it up for questions. What questions might you have?
Please raise your
me?
hand if you have a question, and Robert will bring the microphone to you. This is being recorded, so be aware of that. Any questions or comments? It's been a fascinating story. Okay, here's one.
Judy, our group of four for breakfast. We see Judy at breakfast on Friday mornings with her friends. Yeah.
Yeah, George, I'm just thinking about your experience being separated from your parents as much as you were.
Yeah.
Nowadays, there's it's seen as such a significant, important part of how children are raised that they have close contact with their parents. Can you speak to, you've already mentioned it a number of times, but speak to its long-term effect on you.
Yeah, the elephant in the room when you deal with 19th and early 20th century missionaries is separation from children from parents. I mean, obviously you have to face that. And our greater percentage of missionary kids dysfunctional because of not being able to have been raised by their family than a random sampling of people that were raised in this country? I think my answer to that is yes. Maybe not as dramatically so as you might think. And I think what saved me was, like I've said, I've always been an extrovert. I thrive on being with other people. Introvert, extrovert continuum, I lean extrovert. And I think that's helped me. But I might just say for my brother and my sister, and they're quoted a lot in the book. For my brother, he went out he was a professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder his whole life, and extremely gifted professor. Had 2 Danforths, was traveling as much as he was at Boulder, but he took a year's leave of absence to be a missionary in 1999. But about 7 or 8 years ago, he has completely abandoned religion. Except David, he tried to be a Quaker for 1 year. It didn't take. And as my brother weighed the pluses and minuses of Christianity, he came to the conclusion that the minuses of the Christian faith and the Christian action in the world, the minuses exceeded the pluses. So he has not been to church and will not go back to church for the rest of his life, in all probability. My sister, the minute she got out of the mission home, she just abandoned the church, have nothing to do with it. I mean, she's been an atheist agnostic her whole life. She says she thinks my brother and I have struggled with it our whole lives. My sister didn't. And in one of the letters she wrote me, she said, I think one of the reasons you and Dick struggled so much and I didn't is that I married a heathen. That's literally how that's the exact word my sister used. So for me, but yeah, for a lot of children, Judy, it was tough. I have a friend in the mission home who, because of religious fanatical teaching, literally went, he just couldn't keep his act together. And he's one of these guys that calls me every once in a while, and you kind of dread the call. To get those kind of calls, you say, what am I going to do? So you have that experience too. So missionary kids, they've gone both ways. Listen to the videotape when you get home. Yeah.
Okay, we'll get a mic to you in just a minute.
George, when you went back in 2012, what was the biggest thing that hit you about that return trip?
Oh, good question. About 22 of us missionary kids said, we got to get back to China. So 61 years after leaving China, we go back. And two good friends of mine with a Chinese Christian man organized the trip. And we went back to Chifu. Chifu was one of the places. Have any of you read Shandong Compound? It's just an incredible book. And about 25 missionary kids were essentially trapped in the Japanese swept across the coastline of China, and a bunch of the missionary kids just older than me were trapped in this compound. So it was extremely moving, Carol, to go back to that compound and just to see the conditions that those children lived under. Thank God they had a man by the name of Eric Little. Name Eric Little, ring a bell with you? He was the runner who refused to run on Sunday. And he was their teacher. And he gave his life, literally gave his life to help these children there. And the Chinese government has established a big statue of memory of Eric Little for his contribution to the communist government, for his contribution to China and to being there in China. And there's a museum there now on the China mission that's right there it's called Wei Xin, which is in Shantung Compound. But for me, probably that picture of Dick and me up in Tibet. We got up in Tibet where my dad had been, and just to go out through those plains. They hadn't changed. The tents, the yak skin tents, the whole, it was just as if we were going back 100 years. It was just really quite moving, that part. So those would be the two things of that return trip that I remember.
I want to allow enough time for people to come to the table and look at George's stamp album and perhaps purchase a book. And I want to add, we do have one, okay, go ahead, Tim.
Oh, thank you. I want to ask a question that kind of piggybacks on Judy's a little bit. As I've attended here at Hope Church, I've just been very impressed by some of the different causes that not only the church is in as a whole, but individuals are in. Jane Dickey comes to mind as someone who I know has gone to different marches and travels around to try to have an effect on things that she's passionate about, and others as well. And yet,
Dave Zwart is doing that
sure.
Dave and Karen Dwart do it every single week.
Yeah. So, but it seems, in my mind, kind of reasonable. I mean, these people aren't just adversely affecting their own lives by doing these things. They're doing it. They're committed to it. And yet, when you talk about these families that leave their children for 4 years at a time, or this phrase here, the angels will protect them from the, it's almost plaintive that, you do all these things and you just pray that the angels will protect. And so then that causes me to think about the scripture and Jesus saying, he who isn't willing to leave his father and mother and brother and sister is not worthy to be called my disciple. And Bonhoeffer and so on.
Yea, even your children also.
Yeah. So it gets me thinking. So anyway, how has that gotten you thinking? What's the price that disciples of Christ should pay and that Christians should pay and this sort of thing?
Well, missions today, and John's daughter's a missionary with. It's a different world today. Obviously, we don't have the separations that we had when we were young. And there's homeschooling. There's internet learning. They're the kind of things. But if you were to ask me, where would I have rather been? Would I rather have been up in the border of Tibet with my brother? My mother was an exceptional teacher. She taught for 5 years before she went to China. Would I want her to raise me and homeschool me there or be in the boarding school? My answer to that is immediate. I'd rather be in the boarding school. Would I want to be up in the border of Tibet with my brother and my mother when I could be with other children my age going to a mission school? It was heaven for me. Now, for some other kids, it was more of a struggle. But it's changed now. Missions today, it's a total, there's not the separation that there was back then. You know, the one area of my life I didn't cover, and if you read the book, it's my spiritual journey. When I was a kid, I'll just give you one doctrine we learned. Do you know about the age of accountability? Have you ever heard about the age of accountability? I was taught that very carefully, and all of us were. All children go to heaven. When you reach an age of accountability, when you know right from wrong, that's around 6 or 7. Until that date, you go to heaven. But as of that date, if you have not, this phrase that I don't like, if you have not accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, you then go down rather than up. And I stole some stamps when I was a kid, and for years I knew I was destined for hell. And so I think, and then I just, so as I've been reading as an adult and processing the Bible, trying to make sense out of the Bible like we all do. I mean, even last Sunday, Gordon tried to make sense of an unforgiving servant torturing the servant who didn't forgive. And then he also had the lectionary story last week was on Exodus. Here we are, hundreds of innocent Egyptian firstborn sons slaughtered, and then the chariots of Pharaoh get caught in the mud in the lake of reeds, and so they're stuck there, and the Israelites come down and annihilate all of them. These are tough stories. Did Gordon answer the stories correctly satisfactorily for you last week? Sometimes Gordon succeeds, sometimes he doesn't. This is the way I look at it. But anyway, at the end of my life, let me just close with this. This is my dad at the end of his life. Through all the many experiences of my life, one thing has steadied me, knowing that God is sovereign. This knowledge is my lodestar and continues to hold me on course when things are shaky. I have wrestled with suffering in the world and how God can allow it. Some things will continue to be mysteries, but God's sovereignty is certain. Through all the changes in my life, and every place I have been, I've invested in people's lives. I believe I've made an impact. Although I don't understand everything that has happened, I know with deep certainty that God is sovereign. To the end of his life, Dad lived as he believed God was directing him. At times, he realized there was a steep cost to the rest of us, and there sure darn was. His family, but it was a price that he felt was both necessary and warranted. And the other thing I'll say about this, my mother was a very strong woman, but she knew the passage of Scripture that said, "Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands with fear and trembling as unto the Lord." And when you take the Bible literally, what do you do with passages like that? What do you do with them? Okay, I could get off in a sermon here, but I won't.
Thank you, George, so much for your story.
I'll stick around for as long. I've told Rhonda that I'm not singing in the choir today, so I'll stick around and answer any questions you might have. You want a copy of the book? There's an envelope there. Just slip $20 in it, and thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you, George. Fascinating story. And yes, I wanted to point out, too, that there were books available for purchase also. Yeah, thank you, George.
Yep.
2 quick things. Number 1, next week, Angel Lopez will be here. Angel is one of the new missionary, RCA missionaries that we support, and talk about his brother's ministry also in Mexico, the Frontera de Grace, the border of grace. So please come next week to hear Angel and talk about that ministry as well. Secondly, you know what those tables over there mean. It is Pizza Sunday. And for those of you who know the drill, that means those tables need to go up, and we need 8 chairs around each one. And if you are willing and able to assist with that, it would be greatly appreciated. So thank you.